Hello, welcome everyone to our last class of Humanities 20. Woohoo! You guys made it. We're so glad to see you. As you know, my name is Lisa Wymore. We're going to be videotaping, recording this presentation today, as we always do. And there will be captioning available on the YouTube channel in 1 week if you have friends or family or acquaintances that want to watch it. So I'm the faculty advisor for Berkeley Arts and Design, which is part of the Discovery Initiative here on campus. And Berkeley Arts and Design fortifies creative departments and units throughout the Berkeley campus. And these funds for these talks are made possible by generous philanthropic donations. Unique to the series is our Humanities 20s class. And today's talk is Salience, Finding the Point in 19th-Century Art, with Professor Alyssa Tamarkin. It's co-presented with the UC Berkeley Department of English. And so the questions coming forward are, how does a work of art become relevant? Paintings by Winslow Homer and other 19th century American artists invite shifts in both attention and perceptions of importance with enormous social stakes. The talk looks at how these paintings are pragmatic works that reveal versions of events that feel apropos to our lives and moments today as we turn to them. Professor Tamarkin is a professor of English at UC Berkeley. Her new book, Apropos of Something, A History of Irrelevance and Relevance, will be published next month by University of Chicago Press. And perhaps it's out now? Is it not yet? Forthcoming. Tamarkin received her PhD from Stanford and joined the English department at Berkeley several years. After spending several years at the English department at UC Irvine, she teaches and writes about American literature, as well as topics in 18th and 19th century intellectual history, philosophy, and art. Tamarkin is a recipient of an ACLS Fellowship, a President's Research Fellowship, and a Chancellor's Fellowship. She serves on the editorial boards of the Representations in 19th Century Literature and on the advisory board of PMLA, and she is a past president of C19, the Society of 19th Century Americanists. Before we begin, we recognize that UC Berkeley is located in the territory of Huichin, the ancestral and unceded lands of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone peoples and successors of the sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County and the Confederated Villages of Lashan. As I said, the event is being recorded, and yes, we will be following the hour-long presentation with a question and answer period. So Humanities 20 students, make sure you have your note cards ready to write down questions for our speaker. So let's begin. Welcome. Woohoo!
So it's an honor to be giving the last talk in this Friday series on the very last day of class. Thank you to Lisa for inviting me and to Evelyn for her help, and most of all to the arts and design students for your enthusiasm and for persevering. I understand that you've been discussing your theme all along, perseverance, reflection, and renewal in a changing world. I'm also told that today's talk will be different from previous Fridays, insofar as the changing world in which works of art become the occasion for reflecting on perseverance, in which works of art also feel relevant to us in this way, is not our world, but the historical world of the late 19th century US. We'll be thinking about the very idea of relevance and what it means for looking at the marine paintings of the American painter Winslow Homer. Let me start by saying that Winslow Homer's painting, The Lifeline, about a rescue from a shipwreck, is one of several paintings from the 1880s and 1890s that is interested in what it means for a work of art to attract attention. It was the most money Homer had ever made for a painting. It transformed his career when it was shown at the National Academy in New York. Critics call it the most popular picture in the show, but this is not what I mean. I would like to say, without sounding too metaphysical about it, that the painting makes actual what it is like to pay attention to something, that Homer in these decades and across his late works demonstrates that distinctive way of being conscious that so fascinated the American pragmatist William James, Winslow Homer's exact contemporary, born in the same year. James, who in studying the psychology of attention, describes how focalization, the concentration of consciousness, are of its essence. I think that Homer shows how wonderful a painting can be at seizing something from out of the drift. The painting enacts the psychological process of attention that itself was coming to attention at this time, in which a particular moment gets so arranged that something we otherwise would not pick up on becomes paramount. Homer always floats it as an object of interest. Sometimes, and we'll turn back to the Lifeline, sometimes in the pictures from this period, Homer literally lifts an object out of a current or stream. It is almost too easy to suggest of an image like leaping trout that the trout gets phenomenologically discriminated from the gray indiscriminateness to recall the words that James uses to describe how our interest in something alone provides a foreground and background, accent and emphasis, light and shade. The trout suggests what happens when anything becomes perceptually salient and gets detached figure-like from the fringes of our awareness and emerges as a coherent thing for us, though we had never been so conscious of it before. It was the Danish graduate student Edgar John Rubin who later highlighted the concepts of figure and background for theories of perception in his 1915 dissertation at Copenhagen called Figure and Ground. The so-called Rubin vase or faces vase picture featured in his dissertation came to stand for the figure-ground model of perception in which certain figures rise into prominence against an indistinguishable background. We only see the vase or the faces in alternation, but never simultaneously. As we pay attention to the contours of the vase, we cannot perceive the two faces which do not figure as figures, but as a background for the vase. But then if we shift our attention to the edges of the vase on either side and trace its outline, we can see the shape of a brow and the projection of a nose and the double indent of a mouth, and we experience what is called a gestalt switch between seeing the image as a vase and seeing it as two opposing faces. The point is that recognition depends entirely on where we focus our attention. As one figure rises into prominence and becomes a distinguishable thing, everything else surrounding it is perceived as non-thing-like. As we concentrate on the vase, what was two faces once again becomes mere background, a negative space or surround that is practically invisible. Before Rubin, William James tried to understand how we distinguish figures from the background in which they are perceptually embedded. He wanted to know how anything at all comes into prominence and takes shape and focus against surroundings of less importance, relative to that figure that rises into relief the moment we focus on it. In the Principles of Psychology, he describes how the kind of attention we bring to the world changes what we find there. So it would not have surprised him that sometimes we see a vase and sometimes we see faces. Shifts in attention have significant experiential and even philosophical consequences. What can Leaping Trout be about but the fact that Homer took interest in a fish and is now showing his viewers how such acts of attention can transfigure even it? Against the current, the monumental trout looms in heroic isolation. It is pulled out from the wash and a little out of the picture plane too, which lies against the surface of the water. Its foreshortened head tends toward us a little. As we tend to it, it appears to be angling out of the frame even as we stand alongside the presumed angler of this fishing expedition beyond the frame. What is life but the angle of vision, writes the American transcendentalist Ralph Waldo Emerson, whom Homer read and whose books he kept in his small library in Maine. The idea of leaping trout and other pictures like it seems to be that we might realize these otherwise non-apparent objects by seeing them from a new angle. They become what the pragmatist John Dewey calls momentarily focal, in describing how the mind selects something out of everything in our stream of consciousness and lets go of the rest. It gains contours that distinguish and separate it from the wider perceptual field, which is what allows us to perceive it in the first place. Out of the gray indiscriminateness, that creature leaps into focus and becomes an intelligible entity that is now available for thought. Leaping Trout suggests a kind of sudden visualization from out of the stream, A fish rises into relevance and takes on substance like never before. It comes to bear on us by its emphasis. It grows impressive and distinct. It is like the close-up on a film screen that objectifies in our world of perception our mental act of attention. Every single work of art, Emerson writes, is the tyrant of the hour and concentrates attention on itself. We will pass to some other object soon enough, but for the time being, it is the power of the artist to detach and to magnify by detaching, to suggest to us how much it is the right and property of all natural objects to be for their moment the top of the world. A squirrel, Emerson says, leaping from bough to bough, fills the eye, not less than a lion, not less than a leaping trout, too. A fish we never could have noticed rises into relevance and takes on substance like never before. Around 1890, William James defined consciousness as the way new feelings of relevance and interest enlarge the scope and scale of our experience. From a stream of impressions and sensations, whenever we attend to certain elements and exclude others, whenever an object is welcomed and lingered over, emerging where it had been negligible, we are expanding our sense of experience. More of the vast world becomes part of our intelligible world. Around the same time, his brother, the novelist Henry James, wrote in a letter to his friend H.G. Wells that so far from art being irrelevant to life, and to life being made as interesting as possible, I regard art as relevant in a degree that leaves everything else behind. It is art that makes life, makes interest, makes importance for our consideration and application of these things, and I know of no substitute whatever for the force and beauty of its process. Here very briefly is what seems distinctive in Henry's letter. Importance is made. No particular type of principle or belief exhausts the whole meaning of importance. Importance follows from interest. It defines how a part of life, interesting us, that is, inviting our attention like never before, comes to mean something to us and to matter. Importance is importance to someone. Our consciousness, John Dewey writes in 1887, is not indifferent or colorless, but is regarded as having importance, having value, having interest. It is this peculiar fact of interest which constitutes the emotional side of consciousness, and it signifies that the idea, the object which has this interest, has some unique connection with the self. Most deeply, for Henry James, art is exceptionally suited to raising this kind of consciousness, to bringing, that is, life to consciousness, by making aspects of the world by which we had been unaffected as interesting and important as possible. Art is a vital business for exactly the way it compels us to take notice and care, and it is the beauty of that process that makes James regard art as relevant in a degree that leaves everything else behind. The word relevant derives from the verb to relevate, which has dropped out of use, but whose meaning is to pick up or to lift, as in to elevate or think of a releve in ballet. So to make something relevant is to raise or lift it or bring it up. When we raise a subject that comes to bear for us on the moment that it arises, then we say this subject is relevant. To relevate, then, is to take something up, but actually to relevate, with its prefix re, meaning again, is to take it up again on another occasion, from the Latin originally meaning to lift up again, and also to give relief. From the depths of perception and experience, what had seemed remote or discarded or lost is thrown into relief. Now it is of the essence. It looms impossibly large. The apparent change in the value of the thing does not make me believe that I am focusing on something new, but on something that was there already, all along, in a new light. So again, the word relevant suggests the act of lifting or leaping into relief. In leaping trout, it is the trout that does the leaping. Insofar as the active agent of this picture is merely a trout, we can cast towards something that we almost certainly would have ignored or missed, save for the fact that it now acts as a kind of lure. I actually want to say that the trout is the orangish, reddish lure to which it is likened in the painting. We can see how the fly to the right mimics the shape of the flying open-mouthed trout that is the paramount reality of the picture to the exclusion of everything else. In other words, the trout is the bait. How will we take it? Are we hooked? The English art critic John Ruskin writes of the principles of selection that make a picture highly interesting by calling out that stone or that cloud from the cold mix of sensations that pass perpetually before the eyes without conveying any impression to the brain at all. The chosen object of any picture will seem vital, while other objects pass, he says, actually unseen, not merely unnoticed, but in the full, clear sense of the word unseen. So Ruskin associates artistic selection, what the artist brings out, with love. That trout, stone or cloud, becomes lovely when of all things we pay attention to it. In his essay Love, Emerson says that for a young person in love, love makes all things feel alive and significant. Nature grows conscious. Every bird on the tree sings now to his heart and soul. The clouds have faces as he looks on them. In Homer's painting The Fog Warning, or halibut fishing, a fisherman's dory is falling forward on the crest of a wave. His path ahead is simply a fog. He has caught some nice halibut, and as he looks toward the horizon, he sees his ship, but he also sees an ominous fog bank stealing in around the ship that guides his course, and his little dory rocks high on the waves. In the rapid stream of events that for William James bears us along, there are all sorts of things that pass through the mind in the fringes of consciousness, mere hints of cognition, premonitions, awarenesses of direction. But whenever life communicates an eagerness or a problem to the person who lives it, there the life becomes genuinely significant. Wherever this eagerness is found, there is the excitement of reality, and there is importance, says James, in the only real and positive sense in which importance ever anywhere can be. In The Fog Warning, Homer paints the moment at which the fog becomes important, at which the fog comes to matter, showing itself against the background of the horizon with astounding density of form for a fog. Something in the background of the scene emerges as sensibly real to the fisherman. In fact, the ominous fog is as real to the halibut fisherman as a hook to its prey, which may be why Homer painted the fog to look so much like a traditional halibut hook. This is a halibut hook. I find that the fisherman is hooked in the way that the fog demands his attention. He comes to see its potency and dynamic connection to his life in the dory. The fog in the painting is the hook and the lure for these feelings of connection. Something as insubstantial as a fog seems to have solidified and is on the verge of coming to life. We see it, too, as the fisherman presumably does, in the way the right edge of the right streamer of the fog resembles his profile. Can you see it? Can you see the fisherman's silhouette in the fog? The contour of his nose touches the clouds. The clouds have faces, says Emerson, when we attend to them. Nature grows conscious. The painting has to do with just how the mind comes to attend to its object, with the word attend, meaning literally, etymologically, to stretch out, attend. The painting has to do with how the mind gets stretched out toward that object, as when Dewey writes, attention is most alert and stretched when, because of an unusual situation, there is great concern about the issue. Here the fisherman's mind appears to be stretched all the way out from the little dory to that fog on the horizon, where we see it take shape. Homer shows the very moment at which the fisherman notices the fog and makes a connection between the fog and himself. Right now it comes to matter to him. He realizes it all at once. The Fog Warning is the painting of a fog that is culminating in consciousness. In the Lifeline, a woman who appears to be unconscious is suspended on a breeches buoy between her foundering ship and the shore. She is sitting on the front edge of a lifesaver that encircles a man whose arms and clasped hands encircle her waist. The man's face is completely obscured by a fluttering red scarf that is tied to the rope to signal the location of the buoy. It is a red flag. In the 1880s, the use of breeches buoys reduced the loss of life from shipwrecks by about 75%. For the United States Life-Saving Service, it was much faster and safer than a lifeboat. A cork buoy with a pair of canvas breeches sewn in would hang on a single traveler or pulley. It created a basket-like seat for a passenger or for a coast guardsman to carry a passenger who was unable to cross alone. Homer began painting shipwrecks and storms at sea while living for a year and a half in Cullercoats, a small fishing village in England known for its volunteer life-saving crews and also for its own breeches buoy rescue that took place at night by the light of rockets and that Homer narrowly missed when he was there in 1881. Several of his pictures from Cullercoats show figures like these watching a shipwreck and rescue from the new watchtower. When Homer returned first to New York and then to the coast of Maine, where he finally lived year-round, he continued to paint shipwrecks with spectators. Even in the Lifeline, where they are hard to see at the far upper right, we have figures like the women of Cullercoats watching from the towering cliff on the other side of the ropes. This time, though, the shipwreck feels different, more immediate, since as viewers we are given the vantage of watching the action from some intermediate point on the water, as if we too were at sea. We get the feeling of being pulled in, the threat of immersion, as those two figures get pulled up in the vapor and mist, bobbing, rocking, and then somehow we are buoyed too. I take it that the reality of life outside the picture is the viewer's own lifeline. We can philosophize about this mechanism of salvation while riding the waves at little risk. The woman is soaked through, and her dress clings tightly to the roundness of her thighs and her breast, which swells heavily over the man's hand. Her voluptuous form is pulled down between the man's legs. Her flesh peeks out over stockings where the skirt has ripped and clings higher. The erotic elements are hard to miss. The two figures are separated only by the girdle of the lifesaver, like a kind of chastity belt. The man embraces her tensely, just as his thumb seems to be thrusting into the inverted V of her armpit above his clasp. Behind them, the tip of the rock juts suggestively toward the crotch of ropes as they meet at the pulley. The sensuality of the picture was not lost on reviewers, who commented on how the wet clothing reveals the woman's whole form, making the dress cling to her thighs and bust. She is buxom, one writes. The two figures rock to and fro on the breeches buoy. The woman has been knocked out, but appears in the kind of swooning posture that elsewhere in art suggests ecstasy. This is Caravaggio's Mary Magdalene, in ecstasy. In back of them, there is an explosive column of sea spray called spume. Why is that red scarf there? Critics have never really figured it out or accounted for the weird effect of having that shock of red at the center of the slate and dirty greenish water and just beneath the fulcrum of the pulley. We know from X-rays that Homer added it late over the man's delineated face like a blind. So we do not know really why the red scarf is there, but I know it adds to the sensuality of the picture. Ripples of red that seem to emanate from the women's breast and that alert us to the patches of red elsewhere on that flashy thigh, for example. Just beneath the pulley, the brilliant red scarf at the center of a painting, dominated by the dullest greenish tones, pulls us in. The painting is clearly about tension, realized in sexual tension, and also in the tautness of the thick hawser and thinner pull line as they meet at the pulley, as well as in the heavy bodies tugging downward at the same ropes that keep them suspended. The buoy is traveling right from ship to shore, moving forward, but Homer seizes on a moment of suspension in which all the lateral and downward forces and intersecting lines tug and pull. They leave us hanging. Of course, there's the utter suspense and danger of the rescue. The cresting waves that converge in the eruption of white spume just where the pulley is make it that much more charged. So these figures beat on against the current. Can the man hold on? All the elements of the picture are sustaining and interacting with each other in the way the two figures at the center are. We see, to use Dewey's words, the harnessing of resistance and tension in a composition that is vertically bisected by the buoy with its breeches or harness, the waves cresting on the left and right, the ropes pulling in front of both figures and then on each side of the pulley, pulled, taut, themselves tied to two unseen polarities, left and right. It is a moment of equilibrium that Dewey would call an experience of some intensity, when all the elements of a situation are gathered up into a whole interrelated picture, and there is no slack. Consciousness arises, Dewey says, when a situation becomes tensional. Homer has concentrated our attention at the point of stress. Whatever imminent sense of consummation there may be in the physical effort and weight of the bodies in the column of spume, in the experience of looking at a painting dramatizing the interplay between forces and resistances, the water gathering into breakers, the undertow sucking it back. It all comes to a head just where a head is meant to be, but where we see a red scarf instead. At the center of the picture, where everything is just managing to hang together, hanging in the balance, that scarf makes itself felt as a challenge. What exactly does all this tension bring to consciousness? A red scarf, first of all. It must be more than a mere accessory. Art theorists of the 19th century thought a lot about the role of accessories. As when Ruskin writes about the theory of accessories in his paintings, or else the exquisite perspective that accessories, shawls, garlands, jewels, or anything else lend to their subjects. In Modern Painters, Ruskin describes how the most earnest and pervading thought of great art is aided by every accessory of detail and color. He describes how an artist's power in rendering a subject will be perpetually showing itself in accessories and minor points. The most important book for Homer on the practice of painting was Michel Eugène Chevreul's The Laws of Color and Contrast, first published in France in 1839, which describes how accessory colors and tones modify a viewer's sense of the dominant colors in a picture. In Chevreul, such accessories direct attention toward a picture's main subject by complementing that main subject in a field of relative colors. Homer's brother gave him an English translation of Chevreul's book of color theory in 1860 that Homer cherished the rest of his life. Homer called it My Bible. Inside his worn copy, he tipped a photograph of a fishing boat in color codes. Chevreul's treatise teaches that colors work in an interactive field of relations. His idea, so important to Homer, is that our sense of colors gets modified in relation to other colors and visual stimuli. Principal color elements may be true to nature, but what are called accessory or complementary hues will determine what is visually brought to bear on those principal colors and what they highlight in turn. Color is dynamic and perceived relationally. Even a seemingly monochromatic subject is actually resonating with consonances and dissonances of accessory hues, with spots of red and green or spots of green and red. These other colors may be nearly imperceptible, but make us alive to the main color and the feeling it gives. We could never have the experience of red or green without them. A good artist knows that color needs some other color to make itself felt. So however a color makes itself felt, its depth and force result from the touches of accessory pigments harmonizing or clashing with it. These accessories work by inviting or fixing the spectator's attention in certain ways. Primary colors look most saturated, for example, when offset with their complementaries. For red, green. For orange, blue. Colors appear to us as they do because of the way they intersect or interact with accessories, because of what Chevreul describes as the vibration between complementary or adjacent or accessory tones. Colors that are near to each other on the chromatic scale, say yellow and orange, vibrate quickly and create dissonance, while complementary colors, at much larger intervals on the chromatic scale, say red and green, vibrate slowly and create harmony. The different vibrational speeds between hues are what give each scene its energy, vibrancy, and in a picture, accessories may be adjusted to create a harmonious whole. The psychological capacity of a color to arouse emotion finally results from the chromatic effects of other surrounding colors acting on it. If that blue makes me feel like I have never seen a better, truer blue, then I better believe it is shot through with orange. In the Lifeline, the accessory at the center of the picture is the accessory color in Chevreul's theory, the red-orange to Homer's green-blue sea. The red scarf is an instance both of what Chevreul calls the draperies, ornaments, in a word, all the accessories that complement the main figure of a picture, and of the little patch of color that becomes accessory to its theme. Homer's paintings often stage this dramatic encounter Chevreul describes between subjects and accessories. The contrasts and harmonies focus attention on the relations of elements within a reciprocal system and the way that accessories bring their subjects to light. The greater the number of different colors and accessories in a composition, Chevreul writes, the more difficulty the artist has in fixing the attention of the spectator upon the faces of the figures which he would reproduce. So the Lifeline, as if in response to Chevreul, has just one accessory that we can see. It offsets the face of the woman and also the monotonous sea that might overwhelm us at any moment, except for the way that that red scarf keeps us focused. Speculating at the time about why in the world the red scarf is there, one newspaper writes, Homer originally painted the face of the Coast Guardsman in his masterwork, The Lifeline, but finding that it scattered the interest, threw over the face the shawl of the fainting woman who lies in his arms. The New York Times writes that the hiding of the man's features concentrates the attention very cleverly on his comrade. Other reviewers comment on the red scarf as an expedient which succeeds in centering all the interest on the female figure, or else on Homer's efforts to intensify and increase interest in the woman through the use of the red scarf that is, quote, wrought out for the express purpose of preserving the value of the girl as principal at the expense of the man as an accessory. Homer painted the woman from life, from a mixed-race black woman he hired as a model in New York. He would have learned from Chevreul's book that red fabric is especially well suited for complementing darker complexions. Everything in the picture conspires to draw attention to the woman who is being raised on the buoy, yet Homer especially draws attention to attention's appurtenances, the blotting out of what remains beside the central focus, the way this focus must be accompanied by oversight of the rest. It reminds me of William James describing how attention involves a choice, a selecting principle. Something will always be accessory to the central focus, whose intelligibility and distinctness depends on disregarding what surrounds it. Here it depends on literally effacing what surrounds it. Another figure is banished from our sight. What gives a work of art its harmony, its superiority, James says, over works of nature, is wholly due to elimination. If the accessory is the first thing we see in the Lifeline, it may be that Homer wishes to state just how a painting consists in controlling this process of how we see. That accessory is his statement piece. He shows that he will devise every element to facilitate a focus. Every last element will be contributory, and the result will be a picture that hangs together just as tightly as the figures on the pulley. The painting will gather together all these elements as relating to each other, interacting and sustaining or resisting each other in this one tensive dynamic moment. John Dewey calls an aesthetic experience a consummation. I think we are meant to see Homer's figures as the sensual embodiment of that experience, pressing intently into each other, rocking at the point of stress between the upward lift and downward pull, the momentum and the undertow. We perceive a work, Dewey says, as the organizing medium of the rhythmic ebb and flow of expectant impulse, resistance, and suspense with fulfillment and consummation. A picture should feel integrated to the highest degree. It should be held in tension. All the material in it should be fraught with suspense and moving toward its own consummation. It is the response to this kind of experimental togetherness we see here, with everything bearing on everything else and all the elements gathering force like a column of sea spray about to explode. The philosopher Alfred North Whitehead says about the visual perception of a picture, an extra patch of red does not constitute a mere addition. It alters the whole balance. What appears to be an extra patch of red in the Lifeline, a mere accessory, is very much to the point. It contributes meaningfully to the satisfaction of a picture like this. The painting makes it relevant. We simply would be unable to focus without it. Beside the red scarf, we shift our attention to the woman on the lifesaver. We perceive this central figure as being saturated, soaked through with the surrounding elements, like a woman drenched from the waves, a figure bursting through the fabric and now appearing for everyone to see, a figure whose sensual contours are made visible and momentarily focal. I think it is the idea of the consummatory phase of experience that Homer is trying to float for us here, as if on a buoy. The lifeline is finally a very elaborate device. Its obvious purpose is to pull someone in. How do we create a meaningful object? We need to hold it out from the rest. A painting, Homer suggests, is the result of a changed attention, and it tries to change our attention in turn. It has the quality of bringing out some aspect of the world as prominent so that we become aware of it. It selects in everything we have the potential to perceive the features that are important for some purpose, while showing us how to appreciate those features and concentrate on them. Homer wants us to discover the salient point of what we see. Saliency, Emerson writes in his journal in 1857, is the principle of levity, the sal volatile. It offsets the masses. It is the antagonist of gravitation. Any sort of thing can have salience, but for Emerson, the essence of it will always be on this principle of levity. Salient derives from the present participle of the Latin verb salere, which means to leap. So to have saliency is to have this quality of leaping or of jumping out. Let's picture it like Homer's leaping trout. To be salient is to be perceived as leaping out, springing up, or more figuratively, as becoming prominent or interesting, in the way that Homer and Shakespeare are for Emerson the salient figures of their time and place. Their native force, he says, escapes in fine jets, illuminating the time and place where they are and everything else from their perspective. To be salient is to rise above what is more or less torpid and dull, which is why Emerson makes a play on saliency as that sal volatile meaning, which means the volatile salts, the smelling salts that will arouse consciousness and command awareness. When we speak of the salient point of a work, idea, or experience, we are speaking of the aspect of it that best captures our interest and guides our general view. Defining salience as a perceptual process, social psychologists invoke the figure ground principle. Something standing out in a perceptual field triggers those thoughts and memories that bear on that figure and make it feel important. A very old medical term, salient point refers to the pulse or beat of the heart as it first appears in an embryo. It is the point from which all else springs, the heart of the matter. The Renaissance physician William Harvey believed that the salient point derived from the soul of the ovum, hence the heart. The salient point comes to mean of material things, that which stands above or beyond the general surface jutting out a projection, and of immaterial things, that which emerges as most prominent in a person's awareness. In remembering past experiences, the salient points spring to mind. This creative saliency, the saliency of thought, is what, for Emerson, allows us to concentrate on a moment, to recognize in our experience some particular high point that feels meaningful when we reflect on it. It is the way something old or past or otherwise lost to us can lead to new sallies of the imagination. And Emerson here understands that salience and sally, as in sally forth, borrow from the same Latin root. This is how thinking progresses, which is why Emerson defines the opposite of salience as the path of indolence, of cows, of sluggish animal life, as near gravitation as it can go. If only we can see something as important, as giving importance and essential in some way, it will be a kind of uplift, a way of rising out of our sluggishness, thoughtlessness, or routine. We can be like a fish leaping out of its element. To return to the original medical meaning, if we have salience, we have a pulse. In Homer's The Lifeline, the high jet of spume suggests a moment of salience right at the fulcrum of the pulley. From its earliest uses, salience finally is a term to describe water. Salience is of water, jetting forth, springing, spouting, leaping upwards. A whale's salient spout, a salient spring, something that escapes in fine jets, as Emerson puts it. The salience we see in the Lifeline appears everywhere in Homer. In West Point Prout's Neck, for example, where a single wave crashing high against the breakers is the salient event. From the boundless flow, we have this one moment of condensation. A form springs up before our eyes. The shaft of water so abstracted out literalizes for me one critic's observation of Homer's ability to reduce his subject to its salient forms. The foam hangs but a moment on the wave. Homer considered West Point Prout's Neck to be the best work he had done. No ordinary affair, he said, and there really is nothing ordinary about it, or about any of these paintings that assert what it is like to see salience, or to raise matters we may never have considered as salient for us. The scholar John Durham Peters writes, in an ordinary sense, the ocean has long been thought of as a medium invisible to its users. But Homer takes what is ordinarily invisible and gives it salience, condensing it into animate form. His pictures are about the expression of salience, expression, literally meaning the pressing out, express, or pressing forth of these subjects that must have been mere background, but are now made to leap out the way his leaping trout appears to transgress the barrier of the picture and turn his head toward us. The background comes to the surface and brings its content before the viewer. These subjects express or press forth as if from some internal pressure. Look at this painting, Cannon Rock. We cannot keep this advancing wave crest at bay, rising up, falling forward, spilling over the frame. It is trying to emerge. It just might become part of our reality. What ordinarily would have been mere background, invisible to us, is raised as the focus of consciousness. We are made aware of its presence. Homer is picturing what it means for us to come to us. Since it is rolling forward expressively, emptying its contents, it feels pressing. It is hard to imagine it won't bear on us right away. In his lecture, Human Immortality, William James describes consciousness as crests of waves that rise above a threshold. He includes in his notes a diagram of a wave form rising above a horizontal basal line or surface, in which the line represents the threshold of consciousness, and in which whatever lies below the threshold, being unconscious, separates the conscious crests. When the threshold falls, the amplitude of the waves that cross above it increases, suggesting how we grow conscious of things of which we should be unconscious at other times. Each wave represents a special mental state of awareness, of the infinite things of which we are normally unaware, but that float into our finite world at these heightened moments. The feeling of power in this creative saliency is, Emerson writes, a sort of importation of the divine effort in a man. I think he means by this completely hyperbolic claim what he elsewhere describes as the power of art to bring something otherwise vast and unfathomable to mind, something unthinkable to mind. It is the ability to bring to us, to import in salient form, what we had never thought of taking in, or could never otherwise think of at all. It is the power to harness momentarily that otherwise lost to us or unfathomable thing, as if in a breeches buoy. Or it is what Emerson describes elsewhere as a momentary eddy, in which certain powers are taken up in which they are taken up as salient and of the essence right now. A work of art can, for a moment at least, actualize what it means to feel something as important. As to the miracle that is art, Emerson writes in his journal, it can be said there is truly but one miracle, the ceaseless saliency, the transit from the vast to the particular. This one miracle has for its most universal name the word God. The Lifeline harnesses and lifts up its central figure. It draws our attention to her as if she were as salient as the jet of water that surges in back. The point of all this is obvious, to preserve what it can on a life preserver. The point of all of this is obvious, to save a figure from oblivion. And now when I read Emerson and then look at the Lifeline and the way the woman on the buoy is held out for our notice, I see that red scarf differently. It looks to me, next to the figure it illuminates, like the Annunciating Angel in paintings by Botticelli, Raphael, and Rubens, or in so many paintings by pre-Raphaelites that pick up on these in the 19th century. Gabriel always appears with red wings or else draped in the thick folds of red fabric that come to signal the Annunciation. The Virgin is always set off in these pictures by the angel's red wings or billows of red fabric or red drapery that serve as surrogates for the angel and the announcement he makes. What is Homer's picture, after all, but a scene of Annunciation, an act of making known and intimate to the senses of manifesting without words? Like an angel or messenger, it comes to us. It reveals at once an incarnation, a sensible embodiment of shared meaning, a gathering of something unfathomable in a tangible form we can recognize and experience. This is the miracle of a transit from the vast to the particular that Emerson calls by the name of God and sees as the miracle of art. It is a pregnant moment, a salient moment. It means that things will be saved and not lost. I've been suggesting that the point of Homer's pictures is to express a salient point, and that he tends to do this in very tangible ways, by making us aware of how he is holding everything in suspense, taking in the slack, arranging the moment to call attention to particular values. His pictures comment on the optical conditions for lifting into consciousness some figure raised out of the drift. Homer is extracting whatever it is from the undertow and catching it with a net. He is catching, filtering, and bringing it up glistening as a kind of resurrection. The cross of the wooden oars in the herring net is just the most iconic way of saying that these pictures are articles of faith. The fisherman who hoists up the net bows forward in a devotional stance. His oblique lines parallel the cross behind him. Homer is giving form to a notion of salvation. In the herring net, the foreshortening of the boat has the effect of tilting it toward us, like the head of the leaping trout. The waves are too immediate and rolling forward. The viewer stands just beyond the frame, somewhere along the lines of where the fishing net submerges to the right, and so we get the sense of being there just underneath with the herrings. Those figures in the boat are also the fishers of men. In the herring net, once again, a buoy shines front and center, making a theme of the function of raising up, lifting, or floating for our consideration. Like the life buoy of a coffin that pops up at the end of Moby Dick, it is something to hold onto. The buoy in the picture is reddish-orange, and once again the attentional pull of the accessory colors in Homer, including the red flecks of the herring's gulls, create ocular vibrations within the darker tones of the water. What attracts my attention shall have it, says Emerson. I think the particular effects of the paintings are premised on their attracting our eye and being seen as having attracted Homer's first. They are visual performances of the way Homer's own vision is a selecting principle gathering his like to him, in Emerson's words, then holding it up for us to see. A person's genius, Emerson continues, takes only his own out of the multiplicity that sweeps and circles round him. It is like one of those booms which are set out from the shore on rivers to catch driftwood. The last picture Homer ever completed was called Driftwood. Driftwood shows a massive log wedged between rocks on the shoreline, and the bent figure of a man in oilskins with a rope. The waves are rolling forward, and as the water crashes against the rocks, it whips up and sprays. Homer draws attention to the act of catching driftwood marked by the bent man with the rope and his back to the shore. That figure, in the critic Theodore Stebbins' words, comes as close to being a self-portrait as anything Homer painted. Critics have assumed that the enormous brown log is the driftwood to be caught, and I suppose it is possible. It certainly would be a worthwhile catch for the fisherman with his rope. But the smallness of the rope and the man in the face of that enormous task makes me think that Homer intended the log to be not driftwood, so much as one of those booms that are set out from the shore to catch driftwood, just as Emerson describes. Then it would reinforce the work of that Homer figure who patiently waits for what the water will give up. The culminating task of the artist is this act of catching, if he can. He will find in the sea that sweeps and circles around him something brought out of the drift. To him it will appear as salient as the spray we see past the boom. Homer seems to say that the subject of the painting is constituted by the fact that he turned to it, gathering his like to him, and then calling it up again in salient form. The hope is that now we will turn to it, like the figure before us with his back to us. Whatever the point of Homer's paintings from this period, he seems to make the process of finding the point thematic. I mean by this the process by which something on the horizon, something that was far in the background or the back of consciousness, manifests itself on the surface and comes to us. So it seems that Homer is asking us to find the point, the thing we will not have seen at first, but that then appears to be given to us for interpretation. And sometimes we have to go about finding the point in the most literal ways. It is almost comical, actually, how the secret of Homer's paintings is that this point was there all along, and then all at once we are made aware of it, that this is the point. Do you see that thing here? In Homer's painting, moonlight, wood island, light. There is more in the picture than we realized. That tiny point of red pigment on the horizon to the right is the light of the Wood Island lighthouse. The red flare of the lighthouse on Wood Island on the southeast tip of Prout's Neck shines against a nocturnal sea. The moon, hidden behind a cloud on the horizon to the left, throws a silvery beam on the waves that break silently over masses of rocks. But it is that other beacon, that red dot, that is most salient here. The painting is named for it. It could not be more significant. Nor could this ability to spot the steady beam of a lighthouse in the dark night, where only the phosphorescence of the moon otherwise lights on a treacherous coast. If we look long enough at Homer's picture, that minute thing in the background comes to the surface at the limits of perception and gets meaningfully activated. And that is the point. We should always look for the point of a picture. In Eastern Point light, we find it again in the tiny dot of red in the gray light zone of the horizon. Do you see the point? Between two sailboats backlit by the moon, Homer is making a point of the beam of the Eastern Point lighthouse. The usual practice among painters was to let the horizon fade into visual and conceptual insignificance, writes the critic Charles Colbert. Homer's inclusion of a significant detail in the distance has few parallels. What does it mean to make a nearly indistinguishable red dot in the remote distance the point of the picture? For those boats, at least, it is the saving grace of navigating at night. At moments like these, on a boat on the open waters at night by a rocky coast, there is nothing more valuable. While most of the time what constitutes the horizon of our perception is left tacit, here it is consciously apprehended or realized. It comes to the surface. It emerges into consciousness. Its tininess or remoteness does not diminish its importance, but engages the mind all the more actively for discovering that it has been there all along. Here, in other words, is the perceptual process of finding the object that matters. I don't have time here to explain how, by the late 19th century, the idea of finding the point or getting to the point becomes a question for the work of understanding and finding meaning, and for philosophical inquiry. The pragmatist F.C.S. Schiller, in his writings on relevance, describes how in a successful inquiry, we progressively narrow down the sphere of the relevant and contract it to the point, his point being that for any human purpose we consider only part of the total truth, nay, even of what is before the mind. Finding meaning, then, is a process of finding the point, and not so much a process of discovering truth, but only that small part of the whole truth that serves our present purpose. When we ask what the point of a painting is, it is not to suggest that there are not all sorts of true things that might be said of that painting that are not to the point. It is not that those things are not also true, but that they are irrelevant, in Schiller's words, to conscious, purposeful concentration upon the point. Such selection is the way that perception orients itself toward what is most valuable for us right now. Like the epiphanic revelation of light from a lighthouse at night, finding the point is what guides us. I'm trying to suggest that Homer's paintings seem to be very much about activating the horizon. What had been, in James's words, in the immense horizon, or background of consciousness, comes into the field of view. It is as if the paintings create the experience of consciously realizing the point of his paintings and feeling it emerge. In Eastern Point Light, that point is the point of the picture. It is nothing less than the Eastern Point Lighthouse of a picture called Eastern Point Light. What is deep and buried in the background emerges as the meaningful part. In Homer's penultimate picture, Right and Left, two ducks caught in midair are set against a curtain of sky and spray. Like Homer's leaping trout, these humble subjects are lifted into relief, still as sculpture and gargantuan in the foreground. Homer gives them weight. They're fixed at the point of tension, not rest, as if in some magnetic field of force that is pulling and repelling across the austere canvas, right and left, up and down. A tiny spot of red in the center marks the parallel line of the horizon, right where the gray sea meets the gray sky. Maybe it is meant to be a glint of sunlight, but at least we know that in any Chevreul-inspired painting, any Chevreul-inspired red stroke in a monochromatic field by Homer is always to the point. It focuses attention in intentional ways. Maybe this time it prepares us for the visual force that emerges to surprise us by redirecting interest, by creating expectancy in the form of another red flash to the left in the middle distance. Do you see it? It turns out to be the flash from a hunter's rifle. The hunter balances on a boat and takes aim at a duck, and this feels like an especially charged confrontation because we too are in the line of fire with the rifle pointing at us, and now our point of view has shifted, and the new focus on that point in the surrounding horizon corresponds to the point of imminent need, of urgency, in Dewey's words. No one can make you see the point, he says, but unless you do see it, you won't change your conduct. If you do get the point, you will act differently in response to the sense that it matters. That second red spot in the gray light zone of the horizon is now meaningfully and purposefully activated while everything hangs in the balance. Seeing it begins to feel very important, like a matter of life or death, if we are in fact game. That point of red pigment is the cognitive challenge of the painting, but we are conscious of it now. It is targeting us. This picture, with its gun, knows how to draw. It is hard not to be aware of the expressiveness of Homer's picture, how it discharges its contents, draws them out. In this split-second moment, caught like a duck in mid-flight or shot like a photograph, the hapless birds are given so much weight and emphasis. They've been extracted according to Homer's own selective bent and shot forward even as the left duck's foreshortened head tends past the picture plane toward us. what do we see when we see the point? We see that what turns out to be significant, to be humanly valuable to see, would have been far from obvious at the start. This is a picture that concerns ducks, and it concerns human beings too. This picture concerns us. Between life and death, one bird dives downward and another rises up, its wings spread in the pose of a martyr. It is a dead duck that is also on the verge of an ascension, lifted up. Homer wants us to see it as relevant. One last picture, briefly. In Homer's The Gulf Stream, we see a mastless fishing boat off the Florida Keys, its sail in a pile on the battered deck. A black man is adrift on the boat with nothing but a few stalks of sugarcane to sustain him. His boat has no tiller and is surrounded by sharks. In the background to the right, we see one of the waterspouts common over the Gulf Stream, and to the left, the bare shadow of a ship that may or may not eventually see the man and save him. We are made to feel the force of the foremost wave, also that shark in the middle with its head and open mouth angled out. This is another picture in which everything in it lies toward the surface, falling forward into our space. The horizon is itself an advancing wave. Homer originally sketched the Gulf Stream in 1884 during the first of several trips to Florida and Cuba, and then revised it over the next 15 years. He was fascinated by the Gulf Stream, particularly oceanographer Matthew Fontaine Maury's description of it in his famous book, The Physical Geography of the Sea, which Homer referenced as a source. In describing the Gulf Stream, Maury emphasizes the clash of two separate bodies of water, the Gulf Stream and the sea, each so distinctly marked in color you could trace their line of junction with your eye, the indigo blue of the warm stream from the Gulf of Mexico, channeling through the cold, dirty green of the Atlantic. There is a river in the ocean, Maury writes, running northward past Florida in a warm, accelerating current more rapid than the Amazon and discharging heat all across the Atlantic. In the Gulf Stream, Homer set out to paint how colliding waters of different colors and degrees produce atmospheric effects. The subject of the picture, he says, being wholly comprised in its title, the Gulf Stream, so that everything else in the picture is subsidiary to it. I have crossed the Gulf Stream 10 times, Homer writes, and I should know something about it, which also means for him that the man in the boat and the sharks are what he calls outside matters to the task of painting that great current in which indigo blue meets green. Homer says to his dealer, the boat and sharks are outside matters, matters of very little consequence. They've been blown out to sea by a hurricane. I think Homer means by this that the black figure and boat mean very little to those elemental forces that show no regard for human life. But he also, of course, means what he says, that in the picture, too, they are outside matters, matters of very little consequence to the Gulf Stream. They are the compositional elements that draw our attention to the subject of a picture that is comprised in its title, he says, the Gulf Stream. Everything else in the picture, including the black man in the mastless boat and the sharks circling it, are accessories, in Chevreul's sense, whose significance is figured by their contribution to the impact of the stream. The accessory dabs of red are there not to draw attention to the sharks, for example, or for any other purpose than to intensify and increase the interest of the blues and greens. Pictures for Homer stage these encounters between colors. The harmonies and contrasts focus attention on the relations of each element within a reciprocal system, fixing, as Chevreul puts it, the attention of the spectator upon the physiognomy of the figures he would reproduce. Gulf Stream thematizes this tension between colors, degrees, and values. The dramatic relation between elements is its theme, and what matters. It focuses at the point of stress to show how interaction within environments makes certain colors visible to us, all the adjustments, arrangements, and attunements that fix our attention on some figures over others. So when Homer tells his dealer, in response to concerns of prospective buyers, You can tell these ladies that the unfortunate man, who is now so dazed and parboiled, will be rescued and returned to his friends and home and ever after live happily. He is not simply telling them that the black figure in the painting is only a figure of their perception and that they can imagine whatever fate they want for him. They can imagine that that ship will rescue and return him to his friends and home. Nor does he mean, as one contemporary critic suggests, that Homer does not give a damn what happened to the dazed and parboiled man. Looking at this central figure in a picture that took Homer decades to finish makes that difficult to believe. I think Homer is saying that in a painting like this, the tension between colors and figures is what he also suggests it is in the Lifeline and other works, that is cultivated for its potentiality, for what it brings to consciousness and visibility and makes apparent, and what it brings to the attention and mind of the viewer in this particular case is a figure of color that has been compromised, a figure of color at risk and in the form of a castaway, unless somehow, in a series of ongoing adjustments, we can, so to speak, bring that figure home. Homer knew from Maury that the Gulf Stream is more saturated than the waters surrounding it. As the semi-tropical stream surges north, cooling winds cause evaporation and increase its salinity. It is a place of rare concentration. Homer also read in Maury how waters from every quarter of the Atlantic and everything they carry tend toward the Gulf and its stream, so that bottles cast from across the Atlantic as far as the coast of Africa seem to end up there. I see the man on his boat like these bottles, or like the driftwood, or all the other outside matters and figures that Homer elsewhere draws out with nearly religious devotion, caught in the current. They are bobbing on the surface or popping out like that shoal of flying fish off the side of the boat with their leaps upward skimming the water. They are salient in this intensified place, as if Homer wants to literalize here on the saltiest current in the sea, the pun Emerson makes on salience as those volatile salts, volatility, the smelling salts that will bring us to consciousness. For William James, the parts of our mental life that we select and perchance reflect on may be spoken of as a current within the stream of thought. There are formless, extensive flow of objects and perceptions, and then there are currents running in tension with that flow. A current within the stream is James's metaphor for a punctuating moment that shapes experience through selection and attention. It is the moment in which outside matters of very little consequence, are momentarily held up. They get channeled or put to some purpose. James writes of a current in the stream of thought, but for Homer, a current or stream within the sea is just as apt a figure for these moments of consciousness. What better than a picture of the Gulf Stream to show that things can be distinguished and particularly made out, to show how much might be floated? What better than this picture to recognize what greater concentration will yield up? Thank you.
I wanted to thank you, first of all, for bringing art to life through your words in such a poetic and magical way. And it's something that I, as a dance maker and artist, don't have the, haven't trained to do the capacity for. And I just wanted to acknowledge the, your depth of information that you were able to get across. And I was able to see these paintings in new ways. So I just want to thank you for that.
Thank you.
Beautiful. Yeah. And I wanted to start off with a question, then we'll open it up. But I was just curious, what drew you or what draws you and continues to draw you to ideas of the what makes consciousness and saliency. Like, was there a point in your life, in your career, where that, you've been a neuroscientist or something, or you were just drawn to it through other explorations in studying of art? What drew you to that topic?
It's a good question. I actually was trying to understand what it means when we describe something as relevant. It's become such a buzzword in our current university, at our current moment. So much seems to rest on the ability to be relevant. And I wanted to understand what it actually meant, and when people began to think about what it means to make something relevant. And it turns out that it's not very old, that before the 19th century, people really didn't think about relevance much at all outside of a really limited use in law. And that the people who did start to think about relevance were exactly the kinds of people who were normally considered to be irrelevant, people like philosophers and academics and artists. And they saw relevance as something that they, as artists and philosophers, could make. And so I started to explore that and to think about the relationship between making something relevant and the art, the ability to bring something to attention or to consciousness that would otherwise be lost, right? A way of saving something and making it interesting and important. And the idea that these things don't have intrinsic interest or important, that it's actually our job to expand our sense of what is interesting and important. And then I got to Homer and all these leaps, right? He's lifting out. That's a good question. I've always looked at 19th century paintings. I mean, my primary subject is American literature from within the English department. But I've always looked at it beside paintings for the ways in which they visualize concepts, for the ways in which they play with ideas of attention and how they control our attention, make us see things in particular ways.
Wait, can you hear me? Okay.
I can.
Wait, this is so cool. This lecture was so cool. I had to ask a question, and I'm working right now. But it was so cool. And, I'm taking art history classes. I'm taking an art history class right now about Western art, modern art. And we learned about the Impressionists. And I'm pretty sure Homer's an Impressionist, right?
Well, he's painting definitely at the same time.
Yeah, he's a contemporary.
Same years.
Yeah. So it's moments where you capture a specific moment in time in a landscape. But I was just wondering why I hadn't learned about Homer in my classes. You learn about Monet, and in terms of American art, you learn about other landscape artists. But I never knew about Homer. And I was wondering if you had any insight about the relationship with American Impressionist artists like Homer, if you would call him that, and the Europeans like Monet, and things I don't know. It was really cool. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. It's an interesting question why Homer isn't being taught in the survey. I mean, a lot of the Homer that gets taught is actually earlier. Homer has a lot of Civil War paintings that are much more topical and thematic. And I think that he gets understood to be a kind of realist painter, or what we would call a kind of genre painter, who's focusing around intimate scenes and also kind of thematically based scenes. These landscape paintings come later. They come decades later, and he did see them as the culmination of his career. I mean, some of the paintings we looked at were his very last, including his last painting, which was Driftwood. He was back and forth between England and the U.S., and he was a bit of a loner himself, so he wasn't working in the salons of Europe or with other artists. But he should be included in the survey. There's no reason to leave him out. Oftentimes, American painting doesn't get included in these sweeping surveys of, say, French Impressionism, even French Realism.
Right, but I was wondering, do you have any insight about whether Homer was looking towards the European Impressionists as inspiration or like vice versa, or like, I don't know. I'm just really curious about the relationship at this time between like American artists and European art, because European art like dominates art history a lot of the time. So I was just wondering.
One of the main influences on him is actually Turner. He was interested in British artists, right? And particularly artists of British artists of seascapes. So he is greatly influenced by them, and saw their paintings in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. So he's certainly in conversation with them. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Well, hey, I had a question. I'm curious, looking at all these paintings with this focus on what to pay attention to, I wonder how that impacts your attention in your everyday life.
That's a good question. I think that these works are asking us to pay attention where we normally wouldn't, and the process of finding how something can be interesting to us, especially something that might not be interesting at first, something that might be a kind of obstacle to our interest, dull, boring, cliche, even, right? Just another Impressionist painting, right, that looks much like other Impressionist paintings. These paintings that are asking us to look again and to notice details that we hadn't noticed before and make us realize that if we stare at something long enough, we can make it of interest to us, right? So I think it is teaching us how to expand our sense of what is interesting, and also to define what's important or what's relevant according to what we can get out of it, right? According to the sort of interests that it stimulates in us, right? The kinds of things that it brings to mind. So I do think that all of these paintings are trying to train us, right? Trying to train us to look not just at them, but to look elsewhere, and especially to look at things that we don't normally see, right? To look for what we don't see in what we normally see.
Okay. I know you mentioned James and Dewey, but I was wondering if you could point us to any other like pieces of literature that expand upon this topic.
That's interesting. I mean, the kinds of philosophers or thinkers. Do you mean the topic of attention, or
attention specifically?
So, this is the group of writers who are starting to really think about it. They're learning from a set of German psychologists, but it really is the American pragmatists, American and British pragmatists, who are picking up on these ideas of attention within philosophy, but also psychology, right, and also phenomenology, right, the branch of philosophy. To try to understand how things come to consciousness, right? How exactly anything catches our interest or comes to mind. And so they're some of the first to do it. They're reading Emerson, which is why I quoted Emerson so heavily. And then there are others who follow from them, particularly sociologists in the 20th century, who are picking up on pragmatism for what it can say about attention, but in social ways, right? The kinds of things that we notice in our social world, the sorts of persons we notice, and the sorts of persons who end up getting relegated to the background. The idea that within any social setting, there are some people who are prominent, right? And some people who are what sociologists in the mid-20th century would call background persons, right? Who are often doing the labor of making others prominent. But the idea of seeing any kind of social setting, even political setting, in terms of this idea of gestalt, in terms of a figure ground, so that what is in the background can actually come to the foreground, and how do you bring what's in the background or in the back of your mind or the back of your consciousness into prominence? becomes a sociological question later in the 20th century.
Hi, thank you so much, Elisa. I was just, it was such a beautiful lecture, and I was, had these lines of James chiming with other lines of James, and one that, in his, when he describes consciousness as something that tends to a personal form, this sort of tending towards, and whether there's thought that is not my thought or your thought, but just thought that's in the room. He wants to be able to hypothesize, but it's tricky because it's by definition not something that you perceive. And in these paintings, I'm wondering if there's any analogy between this sort of tending towards personal form and tending towards figuration. Just continuing with this comment about impressionism and what the status or importance or of figure is here. What relationship there might be between this sort of tending towards figuration in the sense of is Homer conceiving of figuration as necessary here, or is there some kind of hypothesis of what would a painting that didn't have figuration look like, in the kind of backgrounds as a possibility that he's anticipating?
That's a great question. I mean, when you say tending toward, I mean, this is the same word as attention, right? That sense of movement, right? A kind of stretching out toward. I think that Homer wants what hasn't figured to come to figure. Does that always take the shape of a figure? No, sometimes it takes the shape of a red dot, right? And sometimes it takes the shape of a red dot that is so indiscernible in the background that it remains a red dot. And yet he's trying to show us how that red dot can come to figure, right? So I think it is a kind of tendency toward figuration, but not necessarily in the way that this figure comes to figure, or that he wants it to come to figure, or the way that the figure in the Lifeline has to come to figure to be saved, right? Saved as in not lost to us, right? Saved in our minds. But oftentimes what comes to figure is that thing that is so deep in the background it doesn't figure at all, right? And it remains in that form, right? So the process is conscious. It's not realized in the painting, but it's realized as we look.
Well, with that, I want to thank you, Professor Tamarkin, for this incredible talk, and just realizing to craft a talk like this is an act of creativity in itself. And so just acknowledging the beauty of crafting such a wonderful talk for us today. So I also am inspired for you all to go out into the galleries now, go to see art, and what is drawing our attention, what is in the background, what is in the foreground. This is such a great provocation for us as we engage with arts and design out in our community. Also, for Humanities 20 students, don't forget you have a final project. It's in the B courses, and make sure to get that done. And thank you all, and thank you so much.
Thank you,
Professor
Lisa.
Tamarkin.
Thank you, class. Last day. You guys are done.